Phil Zuckerman joins us from Southern California, where he's a professor of sociology and secular studies at Pitzer College. Dr. Zuckerman is a member of the American Humanist Association, the author of several books, including Society Without God, Faith No More, and Invitation to the Sociology of Religion. He has edited several other book projects. His books have been translated into Chinese, Korean, Farsi, Danish, Italian, and Turkish. Dr. Zuckerman lives in Claremont in Southern California with his wife and 3 children and enjoys playing soccer and playing bass in a band. Would you join me in welcoming Dr. Phil Zuckerman? Thank you, Phil. Our other special guest this evening is Dr. David Marshall. Dr. Marshall has worked as a missionary and educator in East Asia, combating forced prostitution in Taiwan and researching Chinese thought. He's the author of books as well, books such as Jesus and the Religions of Man, The Truth Behind the New Atheism, and numerous online articles on the impact of Christianity and secular humanism. Dr. Marshall lives with his wife and 2 sons halfway between Seattle and the Cascade Mountains in Washington State. This past summer, he and his sons enjoyed a great hike into the Enchantments in Washington, a grueling hike for them all, and he enjoys cross-country skiing. Would you join me in welcoming Dr. David Marshall? Thank you, David. Let me briefly tell you the format for our evening tonight. We're going to ask both gentlemen to provide 10-minute opening remarks and statements on this topic, which provides a greater basis for society, Christianity or secular humanism. There'll be a 5-minute rebuttal opportunity for each gentleman, and then there'll be 25 minutes that we'll give to some prepared questions that they've had beforehand and a chance to look at and consider before the event tonight. And then we'll have some time also for audience questions. Those questions won't be an open mic. If you have a question at any point in the program tonight, just tweet that, if you have a Twitter account, using #GreatDebate, and those questions will be reviewed at that point in time. Then we'll ask our speakers to have some closing remarks, and we're looking forward to that. I'm delighted that you're here, looking forward to listening in on the conversation. Let's listen in respectfully. If you have those questions, again, send them using #GreatDebate. We flipped a coin before the event in the back here, and Dr. Marshall will begin proceedings tonight with his opening remarks. And Dr. Marshall, we welcome you to share your opening comments for the next 10 minutes. Thank you.
Well, it's great to be here tonight. I think there's probably at least 4 kinds of people here in the audience tonight. For some of you, you grew up in a Christian family, and your family made their faith central, and you know from personal experience that a society, even a small society, built on Christian principles can work. Others, maybe your family went to church, your parents even quoted the Bible, but it was a disaster. Maybe there was even abuse, and you may have some doubts. A third kind of people, maybe you grew up in a secular humanist family, or maybe you spent some time in Scandinavia like Dr. Zuckerman, or in Japan like I did, and you saw firsthand that a society where there's not much talk about God can work and seem to be functional. Or maybe you grew up in a dysfunctional secular humanist family. Maybe you escaped from a concentration camp in North Korea, and you have doubts. All these are possible. I'm not going to be claiming tonight that secular humanism is the same as Nazism, or that it's the worst possible belief system in the world, communism, though communism may be a form of secular humanism. But I belong to the first category. I would come down in the morning, 6 o'clock in the morning, my parents would be reading the Bible and praying, and they lived it, they loved us, they cared for people in the community. If you've seen something else, tonight I would like to give you a bigger picture. Like Dr. Zuckerman, I prefer an empirical approach. That means looking at the facts as we find them in the world around us. I would like to make 4 claims tonight. Number 1, the gospel has changed the world for the better in dramatic ways, making life better for billions or tens of billions of people. 2, what Christianity has done before, it can do again. 3, Modern society has many flaws or needs, which the gospel also addresses. 4, secular humanism does not have a clear and independent record of building great societies, nor does it offer the best solutions to modern crises. There are some troubling signs. Conclusion, therefore, Christianity provides a better foundation for a healthy, happy, free, and prosperous society than does secular humanism. First of all, what has Christianity done for the world? The gospel has provided 7 great gifts, at least. Number 1, charity. Jesus was kind. Historian Will Durant said, "The world had never seen such a dispensation of alms as was organized by the early church. She helped widows, orphans, the sick and infirm, prisoners, victims of natural catastrophes, and intervened to protect the lower orders from exploitation and excessive taxation." Historian James Hannam says that the church acted as the medieval welfare state. Okay, there's ancient, medieval, and now in modern times, sociologist Arthur Brooks says, religious people are inarguably more charitable in every measurable non-religious way, including secular donations, informal giving, and even acts of kindness and honesty, than secularists. And that includes both North America and Europe. The second gift that Jesus gives, Jesus was the original feminist, as ironically Dan Brown put it. This may astound people who rely on media propaganda or even what is commonly taught in public schools. But the record shows that nothing has liberated women throughout history more than the teachings and example of Jesus Christ. Briefly, a United Nations study in 1988 showed that out of 99 countries in the world, the 40 that had the highest status of women, 39 had a Christian heritage. The exception was Taiwan, which was also deeply influenced by the gospel through missions. Rodney Stark, the sociologist, says that in the late Roman periods, Christian women married later. They had more choice in marriage than pagan women. The double standard was rejected. They were not forced to abort babies. The great Chinese scholar, who I think was an atheist, Hu Shi, said, "Let women serve as oxen and horses. This saying is not sufficient to describe the cruelty and meanness with which Chinese have treated women. For 1,000 years, Confucian philosophers have talked about love and benevolence day after day, yet never noticed the cruel and inhumane treatment of their mothers and sisters. Suddenly from the West, a band of missionaries arrived. They taught us many things, the greatest of which was to look at women as people." The third gift, human rights. Jesus cared for the oppressed. When I first arrived in Asia, I found myself in a northern Thai village where girls were sold as prostitutes to visiting tourists. While a drama presenting the gospel was being performed in that village, I went behind the bamboo hut where they were performing it outside and prayed for the drama and for the people in the village. It was while in prayer that I felt called to help such girls and spent a few years trying to do that. I was prepared for this by the book of Isaiah, which I had been reading, and probably by the example of Jesus, as well as direct experience in prayer. This is how most great reform movements in history have in fact started. Against abortion, sacrificing of widows in India, infanticide, human sacrifice, and slavery. Maybe I'll have the time to tell some of the stories of people like John Wesley and William Wilberforce and William Booth and Benigno Aquino later. The fourth great gift is science. According to Richard Carrier, a radical atheist who I debated earlier this year, and an historian of ancient science, he said that in ancient Greece, most intelligent polytheists believed in a creator who had independently ordered the cosmos, and this order could be discovered by the human mind, and such discovery honored God. And he noted that scientists, even in the ancient world, already began to draw on their faith in a supreme God to invent what is now called science. In the Middle Ages, the same thing was also true. Johannes Kepler and other great Rodney Stark, again, has done a survey and found that most of the early founders of different fields of science were pious Christians. The Harvard historian David Landy says that important of all the invention was the church as custodian of knowledge and school for technicians. The Judeo-Christian respect for manual labor, subordination of nature to man, and a sense of linear time all contributed to the birth of modern science in Europe. Number 5, education. Jesus, as you may have noticed reading the New Testament, was a teacher. Robert Woodbury, and around the world, schools have been founded by followers of Jesus, including many of the great universities of Europe and America and Asia. Robert Woodbury, a sociologist at the University of Singapore, said, "The earliest places with near universal literacy, including Scandinavia, New England, Protestant cantons, and Switzerland, were typically economic backwaters, but had Protestant-sponsored literacy campaigns." Number 6, Jesus was a healer. Again, go around the world and you will find hospitals founded by followers of Jesus who healed in the name of Jesus. I've had the privilege of knowing some of those doctors. And of course, the red cross, the emblem of the cross, symbolizes that influence. The 7th gift is the gift of freedom. Jesus came to set his people free. Dr. Donald Treadgold wrote in Freedom: A History, "Hebrew society was unique in the ancient Near East in managing to avoid the techniques, devices, and institutions of despotism." Dr. Landis, again, on medieval Christianity, said the concept of property rights went back to biblical times and was transmitted and transformed by Christian teaching. And he gave some examples from the Old Testament of where that came from. And he pointed out that all of this made Europe very different from other civilizations of the time, especially when the Bible was translated into the local languages of Europe. The peace and truce of God, French historian Georges Duby says, "In the 11th and 12th centuries, many a village grew up in the shadow of the church, in the zone of immunity where violence was prohibited under peace regulations." And finally, I would also like to cite a very eminent authority, Dr. Phil Zuckerman, who points out that Christianity also provides many goods to Scandinavians in his book, Society Without God. Religious ritual feels special. It gives their life a sense of rhythm and poignancy. It brings families together. It makes them feel like they're part of something grand and auspicious. It is fun. It connects them with previous and future generations. They like the music. It enriches communal bonds. So even among secularists, they still are benefiting from the gospel in those ways. Christianity has then served as the foundation not only of the best aspects of Western civilization, but I would argue of world civilization. The gospel has literally saved billions, probably tens of billions of lives by educating, healing, training civilizations in kindness and faith in a God who makes sense of reality. It is the glory of God to hide truth and of kings to seek it out, as Francis Bacon quoted scripture in launching modern science. Christianity has a proven track record. For 2,000 years, the gospel has helped billions and transformed societies around the world for the better, even India, China, and Japan. This is not just abstract theory. The examples and teachings of Jesus are the foundation of much of the best in modern society. That's my first point. The second point is, what the gospel has done before, it can do again.
Thank you, Dr. Marsh. Dr. Zuckerman, we welcome you.
I agree. Sorry to disappoint you. There was a lot there, David, that I would not take issue with, and I'm happy to follow up on what that might be. First, thank you to David Marshall for reaching out and inviting me here. Thanks for David Timms for helping on all the preparation and for moderating. Thanks for Brian Hardwick and everybody else. And I guess thank you for inviting me into your sanctuary. I think it's really says a lot, and I really appreciate it. And I think it's wonderful if we can get to talk to each other. So I appreciate the chance. Thank you. Let me also further acknowledge, David quoted me in one of my books. There's a lot that I admire and respect about Christianity. And if I had to pick 3 things that I think of when I think of Christianity, I would think number 1 of love. I would think number 2, peace or nonviolence. And I would think 3, forgiveness. I think these are absolutely core elements of Christianity, I hope. And I think they should be definitely at the heart of any civil society. And I absolutely agree that Christianity has contributed much to civilization in terms of moral progress. And there's no question that Christians give more today in terms of charity and volunteering and service than secular Americans. And in fact, I would argue I think this is a false premise, secular humanism or Christianity as a foundation for civil society. Why do we have to pick? I would think it would be wise to take the best from each. Let's take the best of Christianity, the best of secular humanism, to have as good a society as we can. So I don't think it's an option we have to really face. But if I'm pushed, if I have to choose, I'll go with secular humanism. And to explain why, let me go back 200 years. 1797. The following declaration was proclaimed. Quote, "The government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion." Now, that was not Richard Dawkins beaming himself in a time machine back to 1797. That was not Christopher Hitchens. That was the President of the United States at the time, John Adams, who issued that legislation, Article 11 of the Treaty of Tripoli, brought to the U.S. Senate. This is only 10 years after the ratification of the Constitution. And that declaration, that piece of legislation drafted by John Adams, was passed by the U.S. Senate unanimously. Think about the Senate passing anything unanimously. Then you might think, oh, Phil, well, it was the start of things. They were probably passing all kinds of stuff. Absolutely not. That's actually not the case. There had been 339 votes up to this point. And of those 339, only 3 had passed unanimously, this being the third. So only 2 previous. Wow. The United States of America is not in any sense found on the Christian religion, and our Senate, our founding fathers passed that unanimously. Why? I mean, it's kind of funny. They were mostly Christians. I say mostly, they were all Christians, but of varying hues. Some were more deists, some different types of Christians. Why would a bunch of Christians creating a new society ratify that proclamation unanimously? They wrote in their Declaration of Independence that there's a creator who endows his creations with certain inalienable rights. And yet once freedom was won from England, once it was time to, okay, we've declared our independence, now we got to fight. Now we've won our independence, now it's time to create a new society. How often does that happen in the world? Where people sit together, I mean, usually nations kind of come about over centuries in weird ways. Here are people sitting at a table. We're going to create a new society. Us. Let's do it. And what did they do? They kept Christianity out of the Constitution. They kept it out of the Bill of Rights. And they declared in the Treaty of Tripoli that this is not in any sense founded on Christianity. The Constitution has no reference to Jesus, no reference to the Gospels, no reference to Scripture. The Bill of Rights contains no reference to Jesus, no reference to God, no reference to the Scriptures. Why? Why would they do this? Well, for one thing, our founding fathers knew very well the damage that can come when you privilege one religion over another when creating a society. They remembered what happened in Europe. For example, the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, nearly all of Europe killing each other over whose version of Christianity was the right one. Protestants against Catholics. Two Christ-centered faiths or traditions fighting for 30 years, somewhere between 3 and 11 million dead. And if you know the population was far smaller then, that's a huge number. In fact, the male population of Germany alone was reduced by half in a 30 Years' War over Christ's followers killing Christ's followers. 100 years before that, in France, Protestants and Catholics fought the French Wars of Religion in the late 1500s, between 2 and 4 million dead. And that's just Christians slaughtering Christians. When you add the killings of Jews at the hands of both Protestants and Catholics, as well as religious wars over the Holy Land between Christians and Muslims, millions more dead, our founding fathers wanted to avoid that. They saw what happened in the early colonies. The Puritans did create an explicitly Christian society in New England. And what did they do? Dissenters were expelled. Roger Williams was expelled. Anne Hutchinson was expelled. If you didn't agree with their version of Christianity, you were executed. Literally, 4 Quakers executed in Boston in 1660. Their crime, wrong kind of Christianity. So we get this Treaty of Tripoli. Our founders knew that if you privilege one religion over another, your society will be divided, and they wanted to avoid that. What did they want to establish? Democracy. Democracy. Government for and by the people. Government by the consent of the governed. It's my argument tonight, at least the first of them, that civil society cannot be good, cannot be healthy, cannot be free if it's not founded on a bedrock of democracy. You can't have a healthy civil society in North Korea. You can't have a healthy civil society in Stalinist Russia. You can't have a healthy civil society under fascism. You must have democracy. It's a necessary condition of a good civil society. We the people. We the people. You can't have a more secular assertion. It's just us. No reference to a god, no reference to a deity, no reference to a devil. We, us, we the people. Democracy is not taught in the Christian scriptures. Jesus does not preach democracy. Paul does not preach democracy. In fact, if I may, sorry, hope it's okay if a heathen like myself quotes the scriptures, Paul taught, quote, "The authorities that exist have been established by God, and those in power should be obeyed. Do not rebel against those in authority because God has put them there." That's from Romans chapter 13. Well, clearly our founding fathers didn't agree with Romans chapter 13. They didn't think King George ought to be obeyed. They didn't think King George was placed there by God, and they rebelled in violation of that scripture. And they created a society not based on Christian doctrine, but this worldly, secular values, secular principles, and secular ideals. In the Bill of Rights, they spoke of freedom of speech. I don't find that in my New Testament. They spoke of freedom of the press. I don't find that in my Bible. Freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, no unreasonable searches and seizures, the right to bear arms. This is the blueprint of a healthy civil society as we are the benefactors of, the benefiters of. It's secular principles, non-scriptural, non-biblical, non-Christian, just some guys sitting around saying, how do we want to have a good society? They created this wonderful country, and so my first argument is you can have no civil society without democracy. Democracy is not an explicit Christian value, but a secular value, something created by humans for humans. I was never taught about the Treaty of Tripoli in school. I'm glad I know about it now. And if there's one thing I can get across to you tonight, it's I hope you'll go back and read it and just ponder what that means for our founding fathers to affirm that unanimously. Now, I have philosophical reasons as to why I think secular humanism is the better choice. I have plenty of sociological reasons, but I think I'll stop with my real political reason, and we can hopefully get into the other material through the Q&A, and I do thank you for listening. I hope I haven't offended. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Dr. Marshall, we just invite you to come back and give a 5-minute rebuttal.
Well, I didn't... Oh, is it going? Here we go. I didn't know I was going to be asked to defend theocracy here tonight. And I didn't know I was going to have to attack democracy. The Treaty of Tripoli, as I recall, was between the American government and, I don't know, wasn't a caliphate, whatever local government of Tripoli, which was a Muslim government, and the United States wanted to make it clear that America is not analogous to Muslim because, and let's go back a little bit in history here again, there's a fellow by the name of Brian Tierney who wrote a book about the crisis of church and state between 1050 and 1300. And what he did was he quoted what different people had said about church and state and the conflict between the popes and the church authorities on the one hand and different governing authorities on the other hand. And there's two verses that seem to crop up in these writings back in the early Middle Ages over and over again. And those two sayings are, "My kingdom is not of this world," and "Give to Caesar the things that are Caesar, and God to the things that are God." When we talk about secular values, that's different from talking about secular humanism. I agree completely that democracy is probably the best, well, I guess not completely then, that democracy is the best form of government. Although I would say that democracy grows out of something more grassroots than that, something within the culture itself, and the culture is influenced by religion. David Landis, again, in the 10th century, said that Europe was just coming out of a long torment of invasion, plunder, and rapine by enemies from all sides. The Vikings were so terrifying, so ruthless their tactics, taking pleasure in tossing babies in the air and catching them on their lances, that the rumor of their arrival sent everyone running. A Muslim traveler visiting the Vikings in 922, the same century, said the Vikings were the filthiest of all Allah's creatures. They were addicted to alcohol, they left the poor to die, and they would have sex with a slave girl before sacrificing her, beating on their shields so the other girls wouldn't hear. And the king lived like Jabba the Hutt. He didn't say that exactly. So 1,000 years ago, the ancestors of modern Danes were sacrificing maidens and cruising the North Sea looking to pick up some monastic bling. Now they're riding bicycles to flower shops in Copenhagen. So what happened? To make history very simple, and maybe overly simple, the gospel happened. Here I agree with Dr. Zuckerman, there was a disconnect over many years, over several centuries, about misunderstanding of the relationship between the gospel and government. But first came a top-down medieval Catholicism. People didn't read their Bibles because they were forbidden to. Then Lutheranism. Now the Bible was more important. And then Pietism. Elgis Orman, Cambridge History of Scandinavia, says Christianity brought with it a new conception of responsibility for the poor and needy in society, hospitals, and whatnot. The Stockholm murder rate, the murder rate in Stockholm in the 15th century was about the same as New Orleans or Detroit today, 47 murders per 100,000. Then the 16th century, half that. 17th century, lower. 18th century, 4, and then 1. And it's slightly increased since then. What happened? According to Byron Nordstrom, the pietists' focus on the scriptures and on compulsory confirmation from 1726 in Sweden and 1736 in Denmark necessitated increased literacy. Now, it's interesting to me when I'm reading Dr. Zuckerman's book to see how many times Danes and Swedes themselves say, yes, our culture is based, not our government. There's a distinction between government and society. And what I'm arguing about tonight, and maybe we're a little bit disconnected here, is society. When it comes to government, I totally agree that the government should not be a theocracy. And I think the roots of that go back to the words of Jesus himself. Yes, it needed to be developed, and yes, there was also inspiration from the Greeks and the Romans, but there was definitely a continuity between the development. For example, if you look at somebody like John Witherspoon, who was also one of the founding fathers, one of the most important founding fathers, who was James Madison's teacher at Princeton University. And the same thing in China, which I won't have time to get to tonight. But maybe we'll continue this discussion a little bit. Maybe we'll see what we're connecting and disconnecting on here. Thank you.
If the argument is that Christianity has done a lot of good in history, yes, I agree. No argument. If the argument is that Christianity had improved certain civilizations tremendously from what they were before, no argument. This is not a debate. I think the same thing could be said of Islam. Did Islam improve the situation in the Arabian Peninsula? You bet. That's not what I'm here to debate tonight. I was asked, what is a better basis for civil society? So let's look at the situation right now. What demographic group in the United States is the most Christian? And I'm measuring that by church attendance, faith in Jesus, belief that the scriptures are of divine inspiration or origin, frequency of prayer. Every measure you can think of. What demographic group in this country is the most Christian? African Americans. Now, what I'm going to say can be misinterpreted, and I hope it's not. But Du Bois would agree with me. What demographic group in this country faces the most problems? Highest poverty rates, highest murder rates, highest teen pregnancy rates, highest diabetes rates, highest unemployment rate, you name it. So, do I think it's because they're Christian? Of course not. It's something else is going on. What demographic group in this country is the least Christian? Jews and Asian Americans. Jews deny the divinity of Christ outright. So there's no, and Jews are actually the most secular group in America today. So we have the group, two demographics, Asian Americans, who do have a small proportion who are Christian, but the majority are not, and they have a high percentage of secular identification, Asian Americans. Jews and Asian Americans are doing the best in this country. Educational attainment, income, life expectancy, you name it, however you want to measure it. Now, what's going on here? Do I think it's because they're not Christian? Of course not. How simplistic, how ridiculous. But this should cause for pause. Something's going on here. Something other than Christianity would help us explain why these two groups are experiencing such different social realities. Let's broaden it. Pew Research gives us a lot of information. What are the most Christian states in this country, measured by, again, belief, behavior, and belonging? Louisiana, Arkansas, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Kentucky, Tennessee, Oklahoma, tied with Utah. These are the states with the highest murder rates, the highest poverty rates, crumbling schools, underfunded hospitals, highest murder rates, highest obesity rates, you name it. However you like. The least Christian states in America, again, measured by standard sociological measures of belief, behavior, and belonging. Maine, Vermont, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New York, Alaska, Oregon, and California. Faring markedly better on all these indicators. Not every single one, and these are averages and percentages. Why? Is it because one's Christian? No, I think something else is going on here. What is that something else? Let's go internationally. The most Christian countries in the world today: Zambia, Democratic Republic of Congo, Guatemala, El Salvador, Ecuador, Rwanda, Colombia, Brazil, Peru, Ghana, Venezuela, Mexico, Jamaica. The most secular societies today, organically secular, meaning that's not being forced by some lunatic atheist dictator. Democratic societies that have given up their religion for the most part. Sweden, Denmark, Czech Republic, Japan, Canada, Norway, Finland, New Zealand, South Korea, Estonia, France, Russia, Bulgaria, Netherlands, Slovenia, Germany, Hungary, Great Britain, Australia, Belgium. Which set of countries is faring the best? So you can take an individual demographic group, go to the States, or go internationally. We see the same correlation. Those societies that are most secular today are faring the best on almost every measure. Compare Japan's murder rate to El Salvador's or Colombia's. Japan is one of the least Christian countries in the world. El Salvador and Jamaica among the most. So if Christianity was the answer, we wouldn't see these correlations. And granted, they're just correlations, it's not causation. Something else is going on here. I agree that those countries that are faring well come out of a Christian heritage. I agree. But they are post-Christian now. Society progresses. Society moves on. Society evolves. We know this. Do I think Christianity contributes much and continues to contribute much? You bet. And I don't want to see Christianity go away. I think Christianity has wonderful, wonderful elements. I just don't want it to be the basis. Not a basis, but the basis. And that's what this debate has asked me to say. What would happen if we declared Christianity the basis of American civil society? I don't think it would be very pretty. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Gentlemen, thank you for your opening comments. You've both given us a lot to think about. Appreciate that. Let's move to some of the questions that you've had a chance to review before we came to this evening. And Dr. Zuckerman, I'm going to actually ask you to lead off in this in a moment. Let me just speak the question for our audience. News networks remind us every day that our society seems to find new depths of dishonesty, violence, greed, sexual depravity. How does your position, secular humanism, offer hope for the future?
Whew, I'm going to try and calm down, sorry. My coffee kicked in. I'm going to go philosophically first of all. As I understand it, and I could be wrong, but my in-laws are born-again Christians. My wife's relatives. I've studied Christianity. As I understand it, my first girlfriend was born-again Christian. Christianity views this world as sort of like a backstage staging area for a much grander and more amazing and glorious or fiery eternity. So when I compare 70 years, 50 years, 40 years to eternity, 50, 60, 70, 80 years is nothing. It's that. That's my understanding, that Christianity teaches that there is another bigger, better, or worse reality that's far more significant than this. Secular humanism teaches this world, this life, this time, that's it. And I know that message doesn't pack churches, but to me and my wife and my kids, this is all I'll ever have. This is it. If I die tomorrow, that's that, life over. I believe that if you think this world, not just a staging area, many Christians believe this world is about to be destroyed in some rapturous tribulational prophecy. And they welcome that as part of God's plan. So if you think this world is just an insignificant blip to get you to a greater eternity, or you think this world's about to end in some rapture and you welcome that, why would you care to solve the world's problems? I mean, what's the deal? If I said, well, we're going to be here for 5 minutes, folks, and then we're going to be somewhere else for 10 billion years, would you bother with like, oh, my seat's not comfortable? Well, I'm out of here in a minute. Secular humanism says, this is it. This is all we have. There is an imperative there to make this world as good as it can be for ourselves and our children, our grandchildren, and other human beings. There is an imperative. We don't get a second chance. This is it. We want to make this world as just and as fair and as honest and as peaceful as possible because for us, this is all there is. And I believe that would lead to a much more proactive and ethical civil society than one in which we teach our children, this is just temporary or it's going to end soon.
Okay,
Thank you.
Well, earlier I was asked to defend theocracy. Now it seems like I'm being asked to defend Gnosticism. We as Christians, of course, place great value on our lives in our short, brief lives in this world, as I've indicated already historically. When I was in Taiwan, I had a couple friends by the name of Frank and Annie Bartolado. They had suffered from a lot of the problems that Dr. Zuckerman was talking about. They were drug addicts. Frank was in the Vietnam War. He married a pretty Chinese girl. They started to sell drugs, do drugs, and started a fight. Her body was ruined by the drugs. The doctor said she wouldn't be able to have any children. Now, Dr. Zuckerman says that one of the problems with secular humanists is that they don't have enough children. Well, they became Christians in what they describe as a miraculous way. They tell me the story. A doctor prayed for her, and she had a beautiful son. And in Taiwan, they set up a drug rehab center. And when I visited their place on the coast of Taiwan, they'd have 50 or 60 people who were drug addicts who were being taken in and helped. They had often taken prostitutes as well. What the gospel does in a small scale like that, I've met hundreds of people like that, changing the world through the gospel around the world. I've traveled to many countries and I've seen this over and over again. What the gospel does in a small scale, it can do in a big scale and has done historically.
Okay, thank you. A second question that we might ask you gentlemen to respond to. How important is a common moral code for the development of a civil society? In other words, can we function civilly with a plurality of positions on what constitutes moral? And Dr. Marshall, I'm going to ask you to lead off on that question, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Sure. Christianity first arose. Jesus preached the gospel. It was not the dominant religion. Jesus didn't set up a camp in Mecca or Medina. The gospel arose in a open society, well, not an open society, but in which the gospel was not dominant for the first 300 years or so. It was a pluralistic situation. So I don't think Christianity needs to be forced or subjected on the rest of the population by any means. And I think that, I'm sorry, repeat the question again.
So the question is, can we function civilly with a plurality of positions on what
Yes,
constitutes moral?
we definitely can, but there need to be some basis for society itself. For example, if Sharia law were instituted in the United States, then obviously we couldn't live in those sorts of conditions very easily, or if the communists took over or something like that. Now, talking about communism, some of the things that Dr. Zuckerman was just talking about how civil society is benefited by secular humanism, reminds me of many of the slogans of the Marxists. I grew up and I studied Marxism when I was in college at the University of Washington. And a lot of the slogans they used were kind of the same way, that, you worry about what's going on in the hereafter, and we just worry about what's going on in the world today. And in fact, communism itself grew up in that kind of a new atheism sort of a clique in Berlin, the University of Berlin. So I do think the gospel provides, I think we have a lot of common ground because we agree about democracy. We're both Democrats. We think there should be a plurality of views, and I believe that the gospel welcomes a plurality of views. And Jesus set the example not of forcing people to believe, but inviting people to believe.
Thank you.
Could have said that a little quicker.
Okay. Man, I thought drooling Vikings who raped women was a tough one to be linked to. Now I've got the just awful communists. Hey, that's history, and I don't deny it. It's true. It's just strange to me that Dr. Marshall keeps saying, yes, we can have a plurality, but Christianity should be the basis of a civil society. That's, to me, very hypocritical. Sorry. But what are you saying? There's a lot of people who aren't Christian in this world. What are you saying to them? I would argue that a plurality of moral values and moral perspectives is an unavoidable fact of the modern world. I mean, you can't wish it away. It's just the way it is. So civil society will work better if we work together for the greater good of all. And this is best accomplished when there's a plurality of perspectives having a seat at the table. Well, if you say Christianity is the basis, a lot of people aren't going to be able to sit at that table. If you privilege one race or one ethnic group or one ideology, only communism allowed, or one religious group, you are squelching the conversation. And that's exactly what our founding fathers sought to avoid. I mean, it's strange to me that this isn't just given. To me, you want a common moral code? Let's take the Bill of Rights. Can we agree? I mean, to me, it's awesome. Awesome. But there's no God in that document. There's no Jesus. There's no Muhammad. There's no Buddha. It's a secular document. My point is not that we're arguing government. My point was that democracy is a necessary foundation for a healthy civil society. And I would argue that if we're going to say, because God said so, and that's going to be the basis of our moral order, we're in trouble. And I could quote, let me just give two quotes, since I don't like to take the worst of my opponent's examples. I would rather take the best and show why mine's better, but here I go. The Christian scriptures say twice in Titus and Ephesians, slaves, obey your masters. And I've heard Christian apologists, explain this one all kinds of different ways, up and down, but those are the words. And if you don't think those words have been abused, you haven't been paying attention. Now, what does the Universal Declaration of Human Rights say? Article 4, no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Which is more open to abuse? The Gospels, which many here believe come from God, slaves obey your masters, or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which makes no pretension to be divine. It's just human beings in 1948 writing something. And they say, no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all their forms. Clearly we see some progress. we see some progress, and it's progress that I would think we could all agree on. So I don't think we need a common moral basis. There can be a plurality, and I think secular humanism is about that. Let's take the best of Buddhism, the best of Christianity, the best of Islam, the best of Confucius, the best of any philosophy, and see what we can work together as humans on equal footing. The minute you privilege one religion, and you may like it because it's your religion, how would you like it if it was a different religion? David Marshall said he doesn't want Sharia law. Well, why should his religion be the one that our civil society dominates?
One of the related questions that we might ask is, there does seem to be a conflict, or at least a difference of opinion, on our confidence in the intrinsic goodness of humanity. Christians seem to take a somewhat low view of the intrinsic goodness of humanity, and therefore are appealing to a moral code, if you like, beyond our ability to just get along with one another. Secular humanists, it would seem, take a fairly high view that we can do this together. How much does, in fact, a civil society depend on human goodness? And Dr. Marshall, maybe we'll start with you and let Dr. Zuckerman take a sip of his coffee because he's been speaking strongly there. Thank you.
Yeah, it's hard for me not to respond to some of that because I think there's a misunderstanding here. There's a difference between government and society. It's not, government should be neutral between religions. But society is influenced. And Dr. Zuckerman is a sociologist, so I can't really blame him for looking at things this way. But I'm an historian, and I tend to look at things historically. How is it that we now agree around the world that slavery is wrong? It's because of the work of the gospel on human cultures down through the centuries. And I think I demonstrate this on one of my articles online. How is it that so many values the world now shares in common? Now, so there's a difference between saying, yes, we should be neutral to religions or non-religious points of view. Yes, the government should be neutral. But on the other hand, what influenced us? What changed us? How did we get from point A to point B? That's an important thing. And there's another question here. We talk about secular humanism being like this. These are the qualities that secular humanists affirm. But that's myopic. That's because we're living in a particular culture with a particular historical influence. The communists, well, I'm sorry I have to bring them bad guys back up again, but you did bring up some bad Christians as well, so I don't feel too bad about that. The communists rejected religious belief in its totality. I would say that secular humanists reject certain aspects of the Christian tradition, but they don't reject it in totality. And I would say that's the big difference between them. Now, I haven't answered the new question, so I don't think I have a right to answer two questions at the same time. So what shall I do?
Let's just have Dr. Zuckerman respond to that. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. My coffee's almost out, so I'm going to be switching to water soon. Well, where do I begin? I mean, I would like to respond to what Professor Marshall has said, but I do want to answer the question. So I'm going to go for it. If history has shown us anything, it's that humans can be both wonderful and horrible. And I think we should avoid metaphysical speculation about an ultimate human nature. Is it either good or evil? I think it's a misguided errand. I think it's clear that humans can and are both. But secular humanism strives to endeavor to bring out the goodness in humanity. And this is best done by looking at the intrinsic value and beauty of humanity. And if we teach children that they are inherently bad, that they have an intractable, sinful nature, I think this is a bad way to create a civil society. And I think it's a recipe for disaster. I mean, when I look at my children, and I have 3, and I look at my cousins' kids, and I look at the kids at the college where I teach, or I look at the kids at St. Matthew's Day Camp where I was a counselor for 10 years, or when I look at the children in the preschools where I lived in Denmark for 2 years, I'm sorry, I guess I'm wrong. I see wonderful love, potential, curiosity, warmth, creativity. I do not see sin in the eyes of these children. I don't know what that looks like. I've never seen it. I'm not a Christian. I don't know. And if you think and you teach that humans are ontologically wicked, born sinful, you've already lost the battle. And I hope that's not what is taught. I doubt it is, because there's so many wonderful Christians. But if you take it to its logical conclusion, that's really the message. We are sinners, and we need the salvation. As a secular humanist, I believe that we have great potential for goodness. I'm hanging my coat on that. I got no one to pray to, folks. So if you aren't going to, if it's not we the people, I'm out of luck.
Great, thank you. Maybe our next question gives both of you gentlemen an opportunity to respond to a number of the things that have already been said, and to look at the other position from a negative, and that is to say, why do you believe that your opponent's position produces a lesser foundation for civil society? And we'll finish on a more positive note, but I'm curious as to what it is about either secular humanism or Christianity that actually is detrimental to society in particular. Phil, do you mind starting us off with that as we kind of alternate back and forth a little bit?
Why do I think
that Christianity might produce a lesser
I'm not so sure that it would. I think the Christian values of love and nonviolence and charity, look at the civil rights. I can't imagine the civil rights movement without the guiding light of Christianity. I am not here to say Christianity is worse or whatnot. I'm just simply saying if I have to choose, the debate was one or the other, I'm going to go with secular humanism for a variety of reasons, philosophical, political, and sociological. But I would say this, and I write about this in my work, Professor Marshall's familiar with it. Again, look at the societies today that are the most Christian. They're not doing so well. Do I think it's because of Christianity? No. I think it's economic. I think it's historical. I think it's political. I think it's cultural. I think there's a whole host of other reasons, but they're this worldly reasons. I don't think it's somebody spiting them. And if you look at the societies today, Denmark, Sweden, the Netherlands, these are definitely, I totally agree, these are cultures steeped in Christian heritage for centuries. But today they are not believers. They have the lowest rates of church attendance, lowest rates of belief in God, lowest rates of belief in the divinity of Jesus, lowest rates of prayer. And they're doing very well. They have the lowest murder rates. Talk about a civil society. I lived in Denmark for 2 years. The way they treat the elderly, the way they take care of their children, the way the education, the free health care, the way these systems work, they are safe, they are moral, they are humane, and they're very Christian. However, I would like to say, well, they have a great Christian heritage. It seems as though Professor Marshall wants to say they need to be believers again. I just don't believe that that's true. I don't see why that's the case. Because the believers today in Jamaica are not faring so well.
Thank you. Dr. Marshall.
Repeat the question, please.
What do you believe about secular humanism in the sense that it produces a lesser foundation for civil society?
Yeah. Secular humanism. Now, it's interesting to look at the word humanism. The word humanism seems to imply that it has to do with human beings, with man or woman in the general sense. I wouldn't argue that secular humanism is necessarily the worst possible religion, as I've mentioned several times before, and I use the word religion rather loosely. But there is a little bit of squishiness about this word man these days when you have people like Peter Singer at Princeton University saying that if a baby is defective, then killing it would be no worse than killing a pig or a dog. And when you have abortion and when you have some degree of infanticide and other things like that going on that are justified philosophically from a secularist point of view, the question that comes to my mind is, are we still defending man, humans, or have we gotten beyond that in the evolution of secular humanism? Now, I would agree that a society like Denmark or Sweden are very nice places for a lot of people, although is, as Dr. Zuckerman himself shows in his book, even when you ask the Scandinavians, they say, yes, this is built on Christianity. These are Christian values. They've been instilled in our law, and that's what they're saying themselves. The Bible prepares us to expect that there can often be a time between when people are following God and then they stop following God, and consequences happen on down the line. It might take a few generations. And I noticed that in Scandinavia, just as in China, when people turned away from God in the Song dynasty 1,000 years ago, it wasn't instantaneous like that, but there was a weakening in the foundation of society. And there was a weakening of the foundation of society, it seems, also in Scandinavia. As Dr. Zuckerman points out, they're not having very many kids, for example. And we could talk about some other examples like that. So I don't think that this particular form of secular humanism that grew up out of Christianity is necessarily the most terrible possible belief system to found a person's belief. And obviously somebody like Dr. Zuckerman is a very likable person, and I have a lot of friends who are like that too. So that's not necessarily the worst thing. But where is it coming from? And then where's it going in the future? What are we going to draw upon? Because secular humanism just says there's no God, there's no afterlife, we should care for ourselves, we should care for other people. But what does it mean to care for ourselves? What does it mean to care for other people? The gospel goes into more specifics on that, and I think the specifics the gospel goes into are the basis of the greatest reforms in human history.
Thank you. I think what I'd like to do at this point, I'm intrigued perhaps by the questions that our audience has, and I would love to be able to have some of those questions come to you, things that you've already spoken to and addressed may have raised questions for them, and maybe we can allow just an extra couple of moments or minutes for those questions in particular. Just for the benefit of our audience, we've got some help, folk who've been helping to receive your questions and work through those, and I'm going to ask if perhaps our first question from the audience could be put on the screen, and we'll take a look at that question and move on from there. If we have a question. Question is, if you admit that Christianity has done more good in the world, then why go any other route? That would seem to be a question for you, Dr. Zuckerman, if you don't mind.
Hey, is my mic on? If you admit that Christianity has done more good in the world, well, more good than what? I'm not saying it's done the best. I think Christianity has done a lot of good and a lot of harm. I guess that's the difference. I just don't see these things as black and white. I can very clearly see the good of Christianity. Professor Marshall seems to be unable to see any good in secular humanism, other than, oh, Phil's a nice guy. I'm kind of shocked by that. I would think that David Marshall would be able to see that, yes, there are some good attributes, some good values here. He can't. Why? I have purposely not rendered a list of horrors done in the name of Christianity. I have purposely not cited the terrifying words of Martin Luther, because I think we should look at each other's best and not each other's worst and see, okay, now who does better there? Christianity, as all religions, ultimately, even though it doesn't want to, I understand there's neither Greek nor Jew nor male nor female, but yet the reality, the sociological, the psychological reality is that Christianity, like all religions, divides the world. It divides us, those between saved and unsaved, elect and damned, saints and heathen, clergy and laity, those that are saved and those that are not. Secular humanism allows for no such divisions. We're all human. We're not all Christian. So if you ask me, do I think Christianity is the best basis? Certain aspects of Christianity, you bet. Charity, love, peace, forgiveness, absolutely. Absolutely. But am I going to make that the only basis? There's wonder. You know who's more charitable than Christians? Muslims. It's part of the 5 pillars of Islam. Zakat. So does that mean I want Islam to be the basis of civilization? No. Mormons are more charitable than Christians. Do I want Mormonism the basis? No. I want humanism the basis, because that is something we all share, our common humanity. And I would like to let your personal religious beliefs be yours to have free, but I don't think that we should dub the society Christian. Look at Hobby Lobby, who doesn't want to carry menorahs. I mean, it's a silly example, but it's illustrative of something.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Marshall, let me give you a couple of minutes, maybe 2 minutes, just to respond to the question, though the question was probably more posed to Dr. Zuckerman, but maybe you want to just respond to some of those thoughts and reflections.
Oh, do you have another question for me? Then I'll take that instead.
Yeah.
I'll maybe work in some of that.
Okay. Do we have another question then that we can put on the screen? Why does Christianity insist on taking credit for the existence of morality?
Why does Christianity insist on taking credit for the existence of morality? Christianity doesn't. Some Christians would say there is an argument that without belief in a transcendent God, then morality is just a subjective whim of human beings. I personally find that argument interesting, but sometimes I think it's overdone. Now, actually, contrary to what Dr. Zuckerman just said, I have great respect for many of the non-Christian religions of the world. I've written a lot on Confucianism and Taoism, and I have a tremendous respect for many non-Christian belief systems, and I have tremendous respect for a lot of atheists and a lot of secular humanists. But my argument with secular humanism is not that it is intrinsically evil, it's more that it's squishy, and it's a little nebulous and hard to pin down ethically. Is that a different question?
Yes, it is.
Oh, okay. So maybe I answered the original question or not. I hope I did.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So let's go to this third question.
C.S. Lewis said we have to be reminded more often than we have to be told, and that's the case with me, too.
In humanism, man plays the hero. Are men capable of fulfilling that role? What has history shown? Dr. Zuckerman.
Thanks for those last comments, David. I appreciate them. Well, I guess this goes to one of your questions, too. I think humans are capable of tremendous evil and tremendous good. There's Hitler and there's Bonhoeffer, both human. I just think this is, but I guess I rely on the newspaper. Forgive me. But when I read the newspaper in the morning, it doesn't say, man successfully goes to market and buys apples. The newspaper doesn't say, family lives peaceably on the same street for 22 years. The newspaper does not say, woman graduates from college with a degree in accounting or engineering. My point is, those headlines that are so gory and awful are the exceptions. That's why they're headlines. I mean, if humans were not up for playing the heroic role, then our newspapers would be full of stories of individuals living good lives, doing right by each other. But that's the norm. Idi Amin is not the norm. He's the exception. That's why he's Idi Amin. So, yeah, do I think humans can play the role of the hero? Yeah, big time. And I'll take Martin Luther King. I'll take Thomas Jefferson. You bet. Heroes every day. But again, if I don't believe in a God, it's all I've got. And that's where I stand. I don't believe. What am I supposed to do? I can't. It's not a choice. I don't believe. Sorry. So I have to look for humans as the sole source of inspiration, knowing full well, and I'll just end here. This is my core belief, people. If children are raised in loving, supportive, peaceful homes, they grow up to be loving and good citizens. End of story. 99.9% of them, there's always a Jeffrey Dahmer. But 99.9%, all you need is love, support, food, shelter, some education, and you're good to go. And that's what we are seeing in some of the most Christian-like societies today, even though they may not be believers anymore.
Okay. Thank you. We may have time for one or two other questions if there are other questions. We'll just... and one does come to us. Aren't the base morals in flourishing societies mostly human rather than Christian? And Dr. Marshall, why don't you tackle that one, if you wouldn't mind?
Many early human tribes were extremely violent. If you look at the Yamanamo Indians in South America, for example, the murder rate was something like 25% of young men would be murdered in some of those tribes. if you look at the great civilizations of early man, well, the riverside civilizations of Egypt or grew up along the Euphrates or in India or in China, they were very oppressive civilizations. People would be sacrificed after the leader, the chief died or the king died. Often that's what you find when you dig in their graves. You look down through human history and you see how civilizations have both flourished and how they've become degraded. And there's no set rule that a civilization is going to progress. What causes a civilization to progress, I believe, are great ideas and great truths. And I believe that the gospel has been and continues to be what prods us forward. Now, there are many people who are no longer Christian in many Western societies, but I believe it's still the gospel that is the basis of pushing us in the right direction. It's not so much that human beings are intrinsically evil, and it's not so much that human beings are intrinsically good, but I do think that history and sociology shows that human beings are liable to sin, that we are created, however, in the image of God, as Christian doctrine teaches. So we have these dual natures. And I do believe that we need something a little bit deeper than just, well, we need to be told to be loving, yes, as Dr. Zuckerman said. But at the heart of that, it is extremely helpful if we have a figure, a person, who transcends human culture and can give us an example of what that love means. And I believe the Christian faith is founded on such a person, the person of Jesus Christ. And it is because we have Jesus Christ at the heart of our faith that the gospel has in the past and will continue to change and transform human society for the better.
I want to thank the audience for some excellent questions. Thank you for sending those through. And you may have sent many more questions that we don't have time for this evening, but thank you for the questions that we've been able to get to. I'd like us to take this last part of our time together this evening and just have both of you gentlemen share with us some concluding remarks. You've left us with a lot of material to ponder, strong opinions and reflections, and we greatly appreciate that from both of you. And we've allotted 5 minutes for each of you to just bring some conclusions, some wrap to your focus this evening. Perhaps, Dr. Zuckerman, you'd start for us.
Thank
please.
you. It's so weird when Professor Marshall picks and chooses his examples. He didn't tell you about the Australian Aboriginals, perhaps the most peaceful society ever known to humans. An indigenous, non-Christian people who were horrified by the acts of the missionaries. So yeah, pick the Yanomamo, the most notoriously violent indigenous people you can find in all of anthropology, but ignore the Aboriginals. Again, he's always taking the worst example rather than admitting there can be hope elsewhere, and I don't know why. I detect its defensiveness. Or maybe that's me being defensive. Sorry. My closing remarks. Thank you again. Christianity teaches peace. But which are the most peaceful societies today? The least Christian. Nah, I should take that back. North Korea is pretty awful too, and they're not Christian. But on average, if we just look at democracies, so let's get the dictatorships out and the fascists out, which democracies are the most peaceful? The least Christian democracies. Who is most for going to war and attacking other nations in this country? Evangelical Christians and Mormons. Who's the least in favor of going to war and attacking other nations? Secular Americans. Child abuse fatalities are 4 times higher in Kentucky than in Oregon. Who's more supportive of guns, owning guns? Last time I checked, guns could be peaceful for self-defense, but assault rifles and automatic weapons. Who's most supportive of distributing guns of all kinds? Strong Christians. Who's the least supportive? Secular Americans. Christianity teaches mercy and forgiveness. Well, who supports the death penalty in this country? Strong Christians. Who's the most against the death penalty? Secular Americans. Who supports the governmental use of torture? Strong Christians. Who's the most against the governmental use of torture? Secular Americans. Christianity teaches love. Amen to that. And yet, which Americans were the most supportive, which among white Americans were the most supportive of the civil rights? Secular white Americans. Who was the most against it? Strongly Christian. South Africa and apartheid. What whites were the most supportive of apartheid? The most Christian. What South African whites were the most against apartheid? The most secular and the Jewish. Which Americans today are the most opposed to amnesty for illegal immigrants? The strongly Christian. I guess there is no room at the inn. But who's most supportive of amnesty for immigrants and illegal immigrants? Secular Americans. Who's most against the Affordable Health Care Act or Obamacare? Strong Christians. Who's most supportive? Strongly secular. We have seen this pattern over and over again. If Christians would be the basis for a civil society, I fear that the love ethic might not be the basis, but division, because we're not all Christians. We're Buddhists, we're Muslims, we're Jews, we're Baha'is, we're Shinto, we're Hindu, we're atheists, we're Sikhs, we're Scientologists, we're Nez Perce, we're Wiccan, we're Druid. And so again, while we may not all be Christian, we are all human. And secular humanism is an orientation to life created by people, for people. Now, I think there's a place for faith. I can't imagine life without it. I think there's a place for hope. I can't imagine life without it. But when looking at how we're going to structure a society, we need reason, we need evidence, we need experience. We the people is how this country was founded. It was good enough for our founding fathers, and it's good enough for us all today. And I will just end with the heart of secular humanism, and that is treat others as you wish to be treated. That is the heart and soul. Professor Marshall keeps calling secular humanism squishy, squeamish, or something. No, it's pretty darn simple. Treat others the way you want to be treated. And that ethic is universal. It is found long before the Gospels, thousands of years in ancient Egypt, in ancient China, all over the world. Why? Because it's based on basic concepts like empathy, for which our brains have evolved for, experience. Its reciprocity is self-evident, and there's no God necessary to understand it or to live it. And I believe if we're going to have any basis of a civil society, it should be treat others as you would like to be treated. And I think we're all good, which, by the way, is also quoted by Jesus. So I see wonderful common ground there. Thank you very much for listening to me. Sorry if I ranted.
Dr. Marshall.
Well, that was like the very last of a fireworks display where all the fireworks go off at one time. I don't think I can answer that in 5 minutes, so I'll have to answer that later on. In 1960, a psychologist by the name of Robert Coles was visiting the city of New Orleans. And he heard about a strange phenomenon at a school called William Frantz Elementary School, so he went there to take a look. And Dr. Zuckerman was talking about black society, and this involved that because there was a crowd of 50 to 70 adult white people who were hanging out in the front of the church of a school, this elementary school, and they were waiting for something. They were waiting for, a little while later, a little black girl who was 5 or 6 years old to walk through the front entryway of the school. She was escorted by federal marshals. And as she approached the school, these folks started to yell abuse at her, call her names, profanity, threaten even to kill this little girl. Now, Dr. Coles had done research on how children endure under stress. So he was curious, well, how's this girl bearing up under this kind of abuse? Because he found out that every day she would go to school, and every day she would go home, and every day there was this mob of people yelling at her. So he got to know this little girl named Ruby, got to know her parents, got to know her, and began to see how she was doing, how she was bearing up under all those stress. And strangely enough, he found that she was sleeping okay, she was eating okay, she was playing with her friends. She didn't seem all too upset. And then her teacher noticed something very strange. As she went into the front entryway of the school, she turned around as if she was talking to the people there who were greeting her in the morning. And the teacher was amazed. Why did you do that? Why are you talking to these nasty people? Oh, I wasn't talking to them. I was just saying a prayer for them. Why do you do that? Because they need praying for. Robert Coles was dumbfounded. He went back home and talked to his wife, and he said, if that were me, I would call the police. I'd get a lawyer. I'd bawl them out. I'd use my superior vocabulary that I learned in graduate school to call them hicks and rednecks, but use more flowery terminology than that. I'd write an article, but Rudy was just learning how to read and write. And then he talked with Ruby, and then she quoted to me what she had heard in church. The minister said that Jesus went through a lot of trouble, and that Jesus said about the people who were causing the trouble, forgive them because they don't know what they're doing. And now Ruby was saying this in 1960s about the people on the streets of New Orleans. How is someone like me supposed to account for that? And with all his sociological, psychological background, he couldn't understand this. Matter of fact, he wrote a whole series, Pulitzer Prize-winning series on children in crisis. And he later described his career as a return to the Sermon on the Mount. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, in summarizing what happened with all the horrors of the communist world, which he experienced firsthand in the Gulag, he said, men have forgotten God. History proves that when people follow Jesus, not when they call themselves Christians necessarily, but when they follow Jesus boldly in forgiveness, in acts of mercy, in recognizing God's work in creation, which is the foundation of science, in caring for the poor and oppressed, yet also expecting great things of them. And that may work out in different ways politically. In healing, in teaching, in treating the opposite sex with pure respect. The world will change, and change dramatically, and change for the better. America has the name of a Christian country. To go forward, we need not to forget God, as Solzhenitsyn said, not to downgrade Jesus, but to build on the example and teachings of Jesus Christ.
I hope you'll agree with me that both of our speakers tonight are passionate about their positions. It's always nice, isn't it, to listen to people who actually hold a position rather than paint a straw man and says this is what they say. And I hope you, like I tonight, have been left with more questions, that this will provoke more conversation, more discussion. There has been a lot of conviction and a lot of thought that's gone into this evening's presentations from these two men. Would you join me in thanking them very much for being our guests?